Primary season for the 2024 election has officially begun. We've already had the first Republican debate. But is anyone going to seriously challenge Donald Trump for the GOP nomination? Joining the show to discuss the 2024 election is Jonathan Chait. Jonathan writes for New York Magazine on a variety of political and policy topics, and we chat about all things 2024. Is there any chance Trump isn't the nominee? Are other candidates in the Republican field even running to win, or are they just running to get a cabinet position? Why are Biden's approval numbers so consistently low? We discuss all of these things and more in this early look at 2024. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for supporting the podcast. If you want to drop us a like, a subscription, if you want to recommend us on social media, we appreciate all those things. We also appreciate our supporters on Patreon. If you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/neoliberal podcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. We appreciate everyone who listens very much, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guest this episode is Jonathan Chait. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so in this episode, we're talking about where we are in the 2024 primary and really the 2024 election. And I think the first thing to talk about when we talk about the primary is, I guess, kind of the broader question of, is this really a primary at all? Or do we kind of have a preordained outcome on the Republican side? Like, do you think that there is a significant chance that Trump does not win the nomination?
I used to think that there was, but I think that was wrong. And now it seems pretty obvious there isn't a significant chance he'll lose. So I recently wrote a column trying to reckon with the analytical mistakes I made in my initial assumption that Ron DeSantis had a good chance of winning. But now it seems even DeSantis' most fervent supporters are all but giving up.
There was an interesting column, and it almost strikes me that if you try to analyze kind of the Trump phenomenon as like a group of people who just want a distinct thing, like they're looking for this specific outcome, that it's almost the wrong thing to do, that Trump is more like this expression of rage or this kind of like id versus ego versus, kind of thing, where really they just want Trump to come in and screw a bunch of stuff up. I don't know if there's a more eloquent way to put that, but it really seems like an id thing rather than anything that people are consciously going for.
Or to put it differently, Trump is not a means to an end, but the end in and of itself. And DeSantis said, well, what if I can try to identify the ends that we're trying to accomplish through Donald Trump, and then I'll say I can be the more effective vehicle to accomplish them. And he even, I think, he wasn't naive enough to say that those are just policy ends, but he says, well, you really like owning the libs. I'm going to own the libs. You really like using ruthless state power to crush our enemies and even kind of follow the Orbanist model of expansive use of state power to ensconce our party in power and to marginalize the opposing party. I'll do that stuff too. But it turns out that none of that mattered as much as the personality of Donald Trump himself. So I don't really see what plan they have going forward. And I don't really see what plan could work or would have worked.
The DeSantis phenomenon is interesting because he's always been kind of assumed as like the number one front runner in the GOP field if Donald Trump were to somehow, get hit by a bus or something. But it's just been very odd to watch him flail about. And it seems like he has no charisma, the ineffable thing that all successful candidates have. And, even candidates you don't like Like, neither one of us, I would guess, is very much a fan of Trump, but he definitely has a form of charisma, and it would be very, stupid to deny that. And I wonder, do you explain this more with like, well, DeSantis is just kind of a slug of a human being who can't connect with anyone on a human level, which certainly seems to be true. There's videos out there of him attempting to smile like a human and failing very hard.
Yeah.
Or do you think it's more of a policy thing that, DeSantis decided, well, the Republican thing to do is just to run as far to the extreme right on every issue as you possibly can, especially on the culture war issues that are really like where our politics exists now. And we're just going to outflank Trump from the right. And, he's run ads about how Trump is too LGBT friendly.
Right.
Or, is it really just neither one of those things? It's really just about Trump's cult of personality and DeSantis's personality, DeSantis's positions. None of it actually matters.
Let me question your premise there that successful politicians need to have charisma. I'm not really sure that's true. Richard Nixon wasn't charismatic, and he was an introvert. He was awkward.
The one thing I'll say is that he was the last president, arguably, before mass media and like mass television took off. And that, I think, since then...
Well, I disagree. 1968 and 1972 were well in the television age. He didn't become more lovable. George H.W. Bush was... he was a very likable person face to face, but he wasn't telegenic. He wasn't charismatic by any normal standards. And Ron DeSantis himself, look, he won by 19 points in Florida. I don't think you can just, wave away that political accomplishment. And I don't see how you can square the current assessments that a lot of people have. And I don't mean to say that you're out on a limb. I'm really the one who's out on a limb. But the current assessment now that people say is, well, he's just completely lacking in any basic political ability. I think it's just hard to say. How do you win in Florida by 19 points against Charlie Crist, who was not unqualified, not extremely objectionable. He wasn't some weirdo that normal Democrats wouldn't vote for. So, I think the focus is misplaced on trying to find his political shortcomings, which certainly exist. But look, there are some mediocre personalities out there who do well in politics. I don't think that's the main explanation. That's why I went back to just the connection with Trump and the depth of the Trump personality cult, which I see is the main cause here.
I mean, I think you're onto something there. I still hold to my, grab a beer test, which is funny because Trump doesn't drink, and neither did George Bush. But arguably, they were still the candidates, when you look at Hillary versus Trump and Bush versus Gore, they were still the candidates that would have won the which one would you rather have a beer with test.
Well, that's true, but look, Al Gore actually won the popular vote. So unless you have some theory as to why the beer test works in the Electoral College but not the popular vote, that's a very fair point. And Hillary won the popular vote too. Right.
So let's not forget that Democrats have won the popular vote. What, like 6 out of the last 7 out of the last 8, something like that.
Yeah.
I think post 9/11 basically did.
Right. So I think that's there's something to it, but I think people really overstate the impact of personality.
Since we're talking about Trump, and you can't really talk about the GOP field without Trump, I wonder if you think the indictments will have any play here with the GOP base. And especially if the indictments can roll along pretty quickly. At least 1 or 2 of the prosecutors are signaling that they actually want to get to trial pretty fast.
Right.
Do you think that if, as the actual trial moves on and as Trump is actively in the courtroom and in danger of being convicted of many of these things, and he might have to go to jail at some point before the election, does that hurt him at all? Because there's this claim out there, some people claim, oh, none of this hurts him. This is going to make him slightly less electable in the general. But in the primary, this is actually going to just help him. People are just going to go even crazier for him.
Right.
Do you think that's true? Or is that like, kind of being too cynical or kind of being too like, I don't know, smug about it.
I think the two plausible reads of the data in the primary are that one plausible read is that the prosecutions, or sorry, rather the indictments have had no effect, and the other is that they've helped Trump. I don't see any reason to believe that they've hurt him in the primary. And it's hard to believe that they will.
I mean, it's an odd situation where he has these glaring, obvious weaknesses that no other candidate will attack him for, except like very indirectly.
Right. And, you know, at this point, the most obvious line of attack for DeSantis and everyone else is, why don't you nominate me? I don't have any pending criminal charges. Wouldn't you like to have a nominee who might not, you know, who will be out of prison the entire campaign, won't be in court the entire campaign? But he can't say that. Instead, they're saying the opposite. They're saying these Democrats are going to, you know, bring charges against anybody who's a Republican. So they're literally just forfeiting their strongest possible advantage in order to cater to the pre-existing belief of the base, which I think gives you a sense of how strong that belief is and how brainwashed they've all become, that Trump's legal problems are not a result of the fact that he's a lifelong criminal, which he is, but that the Democrats have just decided to go after him because he's too strong.
Brainwashed is an interesting term because there was an interesting like poll that came out recently about Trump supporters. And I'm going to get the exact details and the wording wrong, but it was something like, 60% of Trump reporters would believe him over their own like family, over their spouse or their children. 75% of Trump reporters would believe him over their close friends, where like he is basically the source of truth. And so I'm not sure brainwashed, as overbearing a term as that is, I'm not sure that it's wrong, but
Right. Well, I mean, right. I mean, it's a cliche, but when Trump said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose any support, that was, the most accurate statement anyone has ever made about the nature of his bond with the base. They truly would accept anything he did. And I think even if you think about that example, which, he made in a hyperbolic way, if you think about it, specifically, if you try to play it out, I think it's actually true. I mean, if you imagine a scenario where he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, I think, the conservative media would start to say, well, who was this person he shot? What did they do to deserve it? Why are we paying so much attention?
Like, he was no angel kind of, yeah.
He was no angel. Look, so many people are killed in New York City. Why are we focusing on this one homicide when there's so many other unsolved crimes out there? Maybe Donald Trump had good reason to shoot this person. They really would come up with arguments to defend it. So I don't see that statement anymore as hyperbole.
And the wild thing is that there's like a strategic benefit to this kind of insanity. Like he's almost playing a game of chicken with the rest of the field, where like there's, for listeners who may not be aware, like in game theory, the game of chicken is two people driving cars straight at each other, and whoever swerves first loses. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, whoever can be more like credibly insane and credibly like, I am never going to swerve the car, I'm going to keep driving straight forever, and if I die, I die, they're the one who's going to win. And, Donald Trump's base and Trump himself are pretty credibly insane. And so, if anybody goes after them in the rest of the Republican field, it's just this very odd scenario where you've got a stage full of people, all of whom say that the guy who's leading in the polls, who they think should not be elected president and they should be elected president, they have to stand up here and argue that he actually is a great guy and everything that's happening to him is unjust, and actually they're practically saying vote for Trump even as they campaign against him. It's just very odd.
Yeah, there's a couple aspects of this dynamic you just identified. One is that Donald Trump does seem to be able to bring out some group of populist right-wing voters who won't otherwise turn out to vote for a normal Republican. They're just interested in Trump, either in Trump as a person or in someone who seems to be, outside the party system, or, not a traditional politician. That I think is true. There's another version of it that I don't agree with, although I think I'm the only person who doesn't agree with it. That version says if Trump doesn't win the primary, he won't support the Republican nominee because he's a narcissist, and then that nominee will have a split party and will, lose. I think that's completely wrong. What I think would happen if Trump did lose the nomination is that he would view it as a negotiation. He has this valuable thing, an endorsement to give to Ron DeSantis, and he, can trade for it. And what does he want? Well, he would want immunity from criminal prosecution. He would probably want money. And DeSantis would have every incentive to give him those things. So it seems to me like a deal would be in the interest of both parties and would be likely to happen.
That's interesting because I'll admit that without much thought, I have been one of those people who thought, Trump would just go nuclear on his own party if he lost the nomination. And, he's always kind of been 100% look out for myself at all times.
But why is that looking out for himself?
It's a good point. And I'll admit, I have not thought about this very much. And
he wants to stay out of jail. Like Ron DeSantis will keep him out of jail.
Interesting. No, I'd have to think about that, but it's a very good point. One thing that I come back to as I look at, I watched the Republican debate, the first one, and I look at this stage full of candidates, and we've talked about just the overall weirdness of this, that we have a campaign where everyone is expressing fealty to the guy that they're losing to. And so I wonder, do you think that most of these candidates are actually trying to become president, like really and truly? Or do you think that some of them are just running to be vice president, given the fact that like it's not going to be Pence again?
Right.
Or cabinet positions? I don't. That's one of the only ways I can figure like why you would stand up there and kind of embarrass yourself in this way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think almost none of them are actually running for president. I think they're running either for vice president or to build themselves up as brands, so they can have a talk show or the speaking circuit or just better name recognition. I think DeSantis is running for president. I'm not really sure anybody else in the field actually is.
One of the other really interesting storylines, and it's funny that I think about this as a soap opera. I think of this like, oh, what's the storyline? Because that's how American politics works now.
Right.
This is all just a soap opera. But one of the interesting storylines has been Vivek Ramaswamy and his kind of rise from like weird fringe candidate to now maybe the second candidate after Trump. Like
yeah.
he might actually have passed Ron DeSantis. I haven't looked at the polling like super in depth, but do you have any kind of like theory about why he's risen so fast? Or is he a flash in the pan? Because I remember back in I don't know, there was a time period when we were, looking at people like Herman Cain very seriously and Ben Carson. And, I remember that this kind of happens sometimes on the Republican side. Rick Santorum will be leading in the polls for 2 weeks and then disappear forever. And there's just this, I get the sense that sometimes these flash in the pans happen and then they disappear. Do you think that his appeal has staying power, or is this the kind of thing where he's going to be popular for a month and then we're all going to forget that it happened?
So first, I think the reason he's risen is that he's just followed a clever strategy of pursuing every possible media engagement he can get, just throwing himself in front of microphones, and saying a lot of outrageous things that get him attention of all kinds. In the conservative media, it gets him a lot of positive attention, and in the mainstream media, it gets him a lot of negative attention. So it just draws coverage to himself. But I do think he's a flash in the pan. I think he has immense vulnerabilities that if his opponents decided to attack, could just shatter that glass jaw immediately. It's just, to me, it seems like a matter of time until that happens.
Yeah, part of me wonders if this is just another instance of, the most important thing in the Republican Party is to own the libs. There's the theory of politics that, the left hates markets and the right hates the left. And that's really the most important thing that happens in politics. Mm-hmm. And so owning the libs is more important than any part of policy. And the theory here would be basically that, well, Republican voters can kind of instinctually tell that Vivek makes liberals madder than anyone else, even than DeSantis. Like, he just says so many outrageous things, they're going to be fuming, and that's why we love him. And part of me thinks, like, it's not any more complicated than that. Like, it's really just who owns the libs the most.
Yeah, I certainly think that kind of oppositional dynamic is a big thing that he's managed to tap into. By drawing outrage, he shows that he's on their side. But his vulnerabilities are significant. I mean, he once had a Soros fellowship, which it associates him with the most demonic figure on the right, just short of, at this moment, Joe Biden. And I think this is terribly unfortunate, but true, that the fact that he's Hindu, I think, would be disqualifying in the eyes of a huge number of Republican voters. I wish they were not bigoted in that way, but I think they are. And if DeSantis decides to start reminding people of that fact, I think Ramaswamy's support will deflate quickly.
Yeah, it's just been interesting to watch, and you may be right here that he has pretty big and obvious weaknesses. There was a really funny clip of him that popped up, I think just today or yesterday, where he was actually as a student in one of the panels for like I don't remember which election. It was one of the ones where Al Sharpton ran, and I think Sharpton has run multiple times.
Yep.
But he actually asked, and his question, and the reason everybody noticed, he said, "Hi, I'm Vivek. Can you tell me why I should vote for you, given that you have the least experience of anyone here?"
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was a really incredible question to be asking, given where he's at now. But
it really was. I also just feel like it just shows you what a plastic persona he is. I mean, I'm sure there's some element of conviction in the messaging he's sending, but he's really.
Are you sure
really
about that?
Cynical. I think he's
pretty cynical.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He's incredibly cynical. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's, when you said, like, I'm sure there's some level of conviction, I'm not even sure there's some level. I think there might be none. I mean, he seems, there was a good Josh Barrow piece on this where, he said Vivek can't be the next Trump because, Trump is the grifter and the con man, and he owns the libs and all the stuff we've been talking about here for the last few minutes. But Trump is also likable. Trump gives you that wink and smile while he's doing it, and for some reason people identify with that. They go crazy for it. Whereas Vivek seems like the annoying kid in your freshman college class who just raises his hands all the time and is really obnoxious. And,
right.
We've all seen that. Like, Vivek is not likable in that way. He comes off as more obnoxious. And I don't know if that's like coping, like I don't like him, so nobody would like him. But I do think there's something to that potentially.
Yeah, I agree. He's it's very hard to figure out why people like him as a persona. There is this unctuous side to him, but I guess to try to look at it from the other side, there is a little bit of this high energy kind of eagerness and this sort of joy, this kind of prankish joy behind it that I think if
there's an energy kind of like, it's like, I will do what no one else will dare, and that in and of itself is a virtue. I will say the words no one else dare speak.
Yeah, but I'm also just referring almost to his delivery style, that if imagine someone who talks the way he does, but what he's saying is stuff that you agree with or mostly agree with. Maybe you would see him as sort of like a kind of an impish character, right? At least he's not boring.
Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, I'm sitting here reflecting and looking at my notes and realizing that, in all of these notes, nowhere do I have anything about actual policy, which is just very sad. But, I don't think policy is necessarily helpful for this. And I could ask you a bunch of policy questions about, like, is Vivek prepared to, reform the military, and what are his tax plans? And, let's have a serious discussion. But is any of that useful or necessary? Because I don't think it actually helps. Like, I think all the policies for virtually everyone here are kind of just beside the point.
Yeah, I've devoted a lot of time into really looking into Ron DeSantis and trying to understand his worldview on politics and policy. I've not devoted that kind of time to Ramaswamy, and I don't think I need to, because I think DeSantis was actually running and is actually running for president, and Ramaswamy isn't. So I don't really need to think about what would happen if Ramaswamy was elected, because that's not part of his plan anyway.
I think you're right, and I think there's some level of, chance that he gets selected for vice president, or if not that, for a cabinet spot, or just to be a prominent talking head on Fox News for the next decade. Part of me thinks that the vice president spot is probably going to someone insane like Kerry Lake or something like that, but who's not running for president, who would never dare to run for president against Donald Trump.
Well, the only reason you could think of why Trump would pick him would be that, Trump is just an unpredictable lunatic who could do anything. But I don't see any logic in picking him.
All right, so we've got all the Republicans. At some point, though, they will have to run against a Democrat. And that Democrat, barring some exceptional level of circumstance, is going to be Joe Biden. And, we could spend time talking about like RFK Jr., but I feel like he's over discussed to death anyway. I think the more interesting thing would be to talk about Biden and where the general Biden versus Trump matchup sits right now. I think the place to start here is with Biden's approval rating. There are a number of competing theories that are kind of floating around out there about why Biden's approval has been low for most of his presidency.
Yeah.
What do you think explains it? Do you have a personal kind of favorite theory about like what's going on here?
I would lean towards two theories as explaining most of it. Number one, until recently, inflation has been eating up all or more than of the income gains that people have experienced. So for most people, the economy hasn't seemed good in real terms. And now that's changed, but it hasn't changed for very long, and it takes a long time for those kinds of impressions to sink in. I wrote a column a few weeks ago looking at 1996 as a case study. In retrospect, we all say, well, of course, Bill Clinton won. The economy was roaring along. But if you look at what people thought at the time, and certainly a year in advance of the election, and even a few months before the election, there were real questions as to whether the economy was going to be good enough to really lift public sentiment in Clinton's favor. So it seems natural that the economy would be weighing him down. And I also think his age is just very, very significant. You said charisma. We've been talking about charisma with regard to DeSantis. People's assessment of the personality of the president matters to an extent. And the overwhelming assessment of Biden as a person is that he's old and feeble. So and that's not going to change. It's not going to get better. It might get worse, but it's not going to get better. The economic assessments could get better, but the personal assessments I don't think will. So I think between those two things, it's explicable, but it's pretty alarming. And I'm not even sure people have completely internalized how perilous it is right now. It's very early, and polls this far out aren't super predictive. But the truth is, right now, if we held the election, Trump would probably win. They're roughly tied in the polls, or maybe Biden is ahead by a point or two, but Biden won by 4.5 points last time, and he needed to win by 4 in order to prevail in the Electoral College. If he'd only won by 4 points, he probably would have lost. So I don't think he's up by 4 right now. So you've got to hope that the economy continues to improve, and those assessments get driven into the minds of the electorate, or else he could really lose.
Let me give you kind of a bull case and a bear case for what happens with the economy and how people react to it, because I can see two stories happening here. The first case, the good one, is that, inflation continues to come down. We've got a really hot job market, and it continues to be really good. We do actually hit the fabled soft landing that people didn't think we were necessarily going to hit a year ago. and we lower inflation with no recession, with no spike in unemployment, and we just continually have a great job market, and inflation keeps going down all the way until election day. And that's what happens. And in this situation, we could see, well, people were concerned about inflation. It keeps going down. There's some reasons to think this is going to be true. Like there's a leading indicator of what's going on with rent and housing prices that indicates inflation will probably keep dropping. And so that's kind of the bull case of things are going to be good. People are going to react to this. Mm-hmm. The bear case, though, is that I'm not sure that good economic conditions actually matter to people's perceptions of the economy. And maybe they matter on the margin, but there's some stuff out there where, someone will do a poll, and I forget exactly who this was, asking, is unemployment a big concern in the economy right now? Right. And like 6 out of 10 respondents said, yes, unemployment is a really big concern, and I'm worried about it. And, it's just at odds with reality where like labor force participation is really high and unemployment is at a 50-year low. And like to some degree, there's not much else that can be done on the unemployment field. Like you could say, well, we don't live in a perfect world, but we live in a better world than at any point we've had. And so the bear case is going to be like, it doesn't really matter what happens with the economy. The vibes are wrong for some reason, and people are just going to continue to feel negatively about things in kind of a vibey way. I don't know.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that people are able to tell the general state of the economy, but there's a big lag between changing conditions in the way that they internalize reality. They certainly can't disaggregate elements of economic performance, right? If they feel the economy's bad, they'll say every aspect of the economy is bad, even if they're asked about aspects that are clearly good. So that part doesn't necessarily concern me. I mean, people have never had some fine-grained ability to say, well, I like this aspect of economic performance, but not that aspect. They just go on, general good, bad. But I do think, historically, after some period of time, they can figure out. So, again, in the 1990s, the economy was good for years before people thought the economy was good. The economy had really gone through the recession that killed George H.W. Bush's presidency and come into a recovery by 1992. But people were still feeling bad about the economy in 1992 and in 1993 and 1994. And really in 1995, it only started to change. And that process was ongoing in 1996. So there can be a long lag time. And I can't say for sure that those perceptions will turn around in time to elect Biden. But if the economy continues like this, at some point, those perceptions will turn around.
Yeah. And I think we, as a collective political class, kind of forgot how much people hate inflation. Yep. Like we haven't had high inflation for so long. The Fed has done an enormously good job for several decades of making sure that we never peaked at high inflation, since, the Volcker shock of the 1980s. And, the Fed learned its lesson. But then we kind of all institutionally forgot how important it actually was to keep inflation down. And when we finally did get like 9-10% inflation, I think we forgot people just really despise inflation. And maybe it's as simple as, they dislike unemployment, but even high unemployment is like 7% of people are unemployed in the job market in America. That for us, that would be very high, and 7% is a relatively small number. But, if inflation is going crazy and people's real wages are getting eroded, that's 100% of people who are getting affected by that in the job market, and so maybe we've just underestimated how important that is. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the main error was underestimating the risk of inflation. I think people came to assume that inflation had been just permanently vanished and was, sealed in a coffin and couldn't get out of the coffin. But then I think also probably underestimated the damage it would cause on public opinion if it did get out.
Here's a question I have for you. And this, I'm going to kind of throw a theory I have at you. and you're allowed to knock this down because this is my pet theory,
Okay.
and I want somebody who thinks about this more often than I do to check it. But look, I'm an ideological guy. This is called the New Liberal Podcast. We are center-left liberals. We have a point of view, and I'm often very frustrated from my point of view with the left. And I see this kind of phenomenon where when something happens on the wacky right side of politics, the right will basically rally around the flag and will never question what Donald Trump does, and they will always defend him, even from the most crazy stuff. And, we just talked about the shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue.
Yep.
But if Biden does something and it's like, wow, he really needs some support, the left wing of the Democratic Party will often, say, well, actually, Biden is a war criminal and blah, 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 blah. And to be fair, this is a small wing of the party. This is not the influential part of the party. They don't have a lot of institutional power, but they're loud in a lot of ways, in a lot of social media spaces. And they do kind of have a sort of charisma and voice that matters to some extent. And they don't have that, the far left does not have the mirror image of the far right. Well, they will just mindlessly defend the dear leader. Instead, it's more like no matter what Biden does, he can't make them happy. And to some extent, I think this drives negative, opinion polling for Biden, in that there's a wing of his own party who's always going to say, well, yeah, actually, I'm disappointed with Biden, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're describing is the asymmetrical relationship between the extremes in the parties. The Republican Party brought the far right into the party system. There's basically no faction that's so extreme that they can't identify with the Republican Party, right? I mean, even now, Nazis are invested in Donald Trump's success. They're part of the Republican coalition. White supremacists, white nationalists, actual Nazis. They're not the mainstream of the Republican Party, but they're in the tent.
Well, and you can see on the mainstream how the mainstream keeps changing. The people who were Tea Party extremists became the mainstream, right. And then there were new extremists, and now those extremists are now like the reasonable ones, where, like if you had told me Paul Ryan, 10 years ago was going to be like the elder statesman of reasonable conservatism, I would have kind of blown a fuse, but... yeah.
Right. No, I mean, and this has been going on for 50 years as the conservative movement moved from the fringe of the Republican Party to the control of the Republican Party. And then having disabled all the defenses against extremism, was itself displaced by even more conservative figures. Bob Dole in 1976, he was considered the right-wing hatchet man who Ford had to bring in to appease the conservatives. So he was the super partisan right-wing nut to offset the moderation of Gerald Ford in 1976. In 1996, Bob Dole is the nominee, but now he's considered the moderate, and he needs to bring in a right-winger to balance the ticket. So he brings in Jack Kemp to appease the conservatives who think that Bob Dole isn't conservative enough. And of course, after some period of time, Jack Kemp, of course, becomes the old moderate, reasonable Republican Party. So this process has just been going on for decades, and it hasn't stopped. The Democratic Party is moving to the left, but there certainly are factions on the left who are outside the Democratic Party, right? Keep going further left, and you'll find people who no longer identify with the Democratic Party, aren't invested in its success, aren't in the tent at all. So I think that's what you're describing, is people who are just outside the tent. Now, there are pluses and minuses to both arrangements. It's true that if you don't have any extremists on your side who are going to stab you in the back on social media, you can have a kind of unified voice. But they're also going to have influence over your messaging and your policies, and they're often going to steer you into crazy and dangerous directions. So that has kind of defined the political strategy of the Republican Party over a long period of time, of investing everything in just having no enemies to the right, united ideological front, with the advantages that brings, but with the disadvantages of disabling all your defenses against extremism and disabling your mechanisms for internal correction and critique. There are people on the left who I think look at the success of the conservative movement in taking over the Republican Party as a model to emulate within the Democratic Party. And I think they are trying to basically mirror image that model within the Democratic Party. I think they point to the successful aspects of the conservative movement takeover of the Republican Party and say, we need to fight fire with fire. But I think they're overlooking the pretty significant downsides that kind of arrangement brings. But having a no enemies to the left political strategy, disabling your own channels for internal critique and correction, and allowing yourself to be captured by a lot of ideologically extreme points of view. Now, I don't think the Democratic Party has mirrored the Republican Party. I think at worst we're at the beginning stages of that process, and it's a process that may never be completed. But I think that's the question on the left, is whether we should look at what's happened in the Republican Party as a model or as a cautionary tale. I look at it as a cautionary tale.
I think that's all good points. And, I want to acknowledge that, this is a very convenient position for me to have as someone on the center left, that, oh, well, the left won't just play ball. Of course, that's what I would say. But I do think there's something to that, at least in a straight up opinion poll, the left wing of the Democratic Party seems likely to express their own discontent, which is a completely different kind of discontent with Biden than someone who's on the political right. Mm-hmm. We are coming up on time soon, so I have just one or two more questions. If we were going to play the game of, you get to be in charge of Joe Biden's campaign strategy, because you and I, again, we have points of view. We're not really neutral observers here.
Right.
We both want Joe Biden to win the presidency, and we think it would be a terrible thing if Trump got reelected. So if you were running Biden's campaign, what would you focus on? Is there some particular message or some particular strategy that you think would work, or is this something where you're just like, you know what, I'm going to leave that to the professionals, or what's your game plan if you have one?
And you're assuming that Trump is the opponent?
At this point, I think we have to, unless, again, there's some sort of hit by a bus thing, or unless he actually goes to jail, which might finally hurt his numbers. I think we have to assume that.
Right. So I think, obviously this is going to be conventional wisdom, but the crucial dynamic for Biden is to have it be a choice election rather than a referendum election. And fortunately, Donald Trump is a big enough personality that he's not going to be able to fade into the background and make it become a referendum election, because he would probably lose a referendum. But in a choice election, Biden can say peace and prosperity versus chaos and hatred. And I think that's a pretty simple, clear message. If we don't have peace and prosperity, he's going to lose. So that's what he's got to run on, and hope that in 15 months we still have peace and prosperity.
Peace is an interesting addition there, just because, talking about his popularity, I think the time when his polls actually dropped really drastically was when he pulled out of Afghanistan.
Yep.
And admittedly, that was a bit of a fiasco. Perhaps it could have been done better. Perhaps not. I'm not a military planner. I don't know whether or not they did the best they could. But that was like an instance where his polling dropped like 6, 7, 8 points overnight, it seemed like, and it's never really recovered. And it's very odd that I feel like Biden gets like no credit from the people who typically scream about like U.S. imperialism all over the world and forever wars. And like, he ended the war in Afghanistan. He did what Obama and Trump would not do, and actually just cut the cord and said, we're getting out of here. It's been long enough. Whether you think that was a good thing or a bad thing, he did it. And it feels like it only hurt him, even though, you can play the peace card now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think part of it was the timing. Biden comes in after January 6th and kind of has a honeymoon period. He's really, playing the role of the calm grandfatherly figure who's restoring norms in democracy. And Trump had left in the most disgraceful way. And You even had a lot of Republicans who really were sort of wishing goodwill for Biden, at least more than they normally would for a Democratic president. So he had this period of very positive press coverage. And I really think the news media decided implicitly or explicitly that they had been soft on him for too long and really needed to start criticizing him. So here was a policy opinion where he really was generating some pushback that didn't come exclusively from Trump or even Fox News, right? Where you had some credentialed people, military experts who didn't like the policy and were attacking the policy. So they really gave those critiques a big platform. And I think that that coverage really dented the administration's reputation for competence in a way that it never recovered from. I mean, the alternate theory is that when inflation started to take off, that undercut assessments of the economy. I think you could maybe blend those two theories together, but
I think that media theory is interesting because it just speaks to another, what do you call it, an imbalance between the left and right wing in terms of the way that like center left and left media will cover a Democratic president as opposed to the way right media covers a Republican president.
Right. I mean, so Democratic voters get their news from the mainstream media for the most part. And those mainstream media at least attempt to follow norms of journalistic neutrality and objectivity. Now, they may fail, and you may, not every story is great. And they're often trying to balance between their maybe innate socially liberal, college-educated biases and their desire to not be seen as in the tank for Democrats. And sometimes they are on one side and sometimes they are on the other side. But the point is they're trying to follow norms of objectivity. And so the news that Democratic voters get is going to include criticism of those Democratic figures, because you're not going to just run a propaganda operation in CNN or the New York Times or local news. Even if they're making errors on the liberal side, there's going to be plenty of criticism of any Democratic president. Whereas Republican voters get their news from conservative news sources that are not attempting to follow norms of objectivity. The belief in conservative media is the liberal media are in the tank. These norms are a joke. Why should we follow these norms? And they basically operate as a political messaging system. So you're never going to get criticism of a Republican presidency in conservative media. So there is a very serious imbalance in the news diet of the bases of the two parties. But let me again point to the flip side of that. The flip side of that is that Democrats have to be responsive to a critical media that's going to point out their errors and is going to poke holes in their arguments. It's going to hold them to account for lying, is going to hold them to account for corruption, and force them to course correct. Republicans don't have those guardrails. They can speak to their base, and they'll have a friendly media that will support them no matter how off the rails they go. So while there are messaging advantages to having a propaganda medium that also creates these internal cultures where bad actors can prevail, corruption can prevail, bad ideas, ideological extremism can all go unchallenged. So what the Republicans have isn't a picnic either.
Well, we're coming up on time, and as much as I would love to dive into that very much even deeper, we don't want to take up too much of your time. So we'll close with the traditional final question that we always ask every guest on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more if they're interested in what we're talking about today? If they're interested in the 2024 election or just the political dynamics we're talking about of the party system, of how Trump operates, what would you recommend that they go do? I'll start and say everyone should go to New York Magazine and read John Chait's columns because they're fantastic.
That was my answer.
So go read him. But is there anyone
you took
else?
My answer.
I know. But is there anyone else? This could be just someone to follow on Twitter, a blog to follow, a particular writer who's good, a books people should read, anything that you think would be helpful for people who are interested here.
So let me try to come up with some names that aren't maybe as familiar as then if I gave you, my favorite New York Times columnists. I guess everyone on Substack, everyone knows about Matt Iglesias now. Jill Filipovic is a really good writer on Substack who I've been following a lot recently.
Excellent. Well, hopefully things will go well over the next year. Hopefully politics will calm down at some point, I hope. But we're just going to have to wait and see. Until then, I want to say thank you to my guest, Jonathan Chait. John, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot. It was fun.